Welcome to the Herd and Corridor podcast, a podcast about making sense of business within the U.S.-India corridor and beyond. I'm your host, Angela Chitkara, and I'm here in Abu Dhabi at the Milken Summit with the U.S. Ambassador to India, Eric Garcetti. Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome to the Herd and the Corridor podcast.
Great to be with you. Great to be with all of you out there as well. This amazing place where we're kind of between our two countries geographically and metaphorically.
Ambassador, I am so impressed with your understanding, your level of understanding of India. I mean, I had spent 2 years there. I was born in Astoria, Queens,
Right.
and I had gone there back and forth, throughout my life to visit my grandparents. But when I lived there, it was a different feeling altogether. It was like a homecoming. Yet I never lived in India, but there was like a cultural, closeness. And so being from LA, and growing up, you had mentioned that your first trip to India was, I think, at the age of 14.
Correct.
And you're a fellow Columbia alum.
Yes.
So tell us about that story. And in my experience, I felt like, having only spent 2 years there, I felt like I was just scratching the surface. So how do you feel now as outgoing, the outgoing ambassador to India?
Right.
What are your observations?
I feel like I can't remember a time when I wasn't in India. I can't remember a time when I wasn't learning about India. And India is very different than going, let's say, to a smaller country where you can go to every single part of it, really get to know people everywhere. India, you can spend your entire life traveling in. You can be Indian and still, like in America, it's such a broad place, but think about 4 times the population of America. And only, I wouldn't say scratch the surface because you get quite deep, but I always say it this way: don't try to intellectually understand or conquer knowing India. You won't. The more you learn, like if it was a buffet, the more you eat, the bigger the buffet gets.
Right.
And so what you're going to do is navigate your own meal. You're going to figure out how you curate your own experience. You're going to make the lasting impact that you can have on India, and vice versa. India, since I came at 14, and I came just as a tourist with my parents and my older sister, it immediately captured my heart, and kind of India stayed with me forever. And you can go one time and feel that, or you can go dozens of times like I have and feel that. And it was that experience as a teenager that led me at Columbia to study Hindi and Urdu, to start reading the great Indian religious and cultural texts, coincidentally to have a college roommate whose father became the U.S. ambassador to India. I mean, if you don't believe in karma, this story will, put it out there that somehow my second trip was visiting the United States ambassador to India, staying at the embassy, never imagining that I'd come back one day as the actual U.S. ambassador. But that's how India works. There's a little bit of magic to it. There's a little bit of challenge to it. There's a little bit of struggle to it. There's an immense amount of pleasure and discovery to it. And if you're just getting to know the U.S.-India relationship, your timing is perfect, because it is, as the president said, the most consequential relationship in the world right now between two nations. But I would add 2 other C's. It's consequential. It's also compelling. You'll get something personally out of it. So it's making a difference in the world. It's compelling in the sense that there's so much you want to know. But it's also, if we're honest, challenging. You have to know, how do you navigate those difficulties, whether it's the state-to-state negotiations, whether it's doing business there, or even as a visitor. And I love being a small A ambassador for Americans to understand India a little bit better, and for India to teach me things that I can take back to America.
So tell us about what India's taught you. What is the India story, right? Let's start with that. What has India taught you?
That's a great question. I think the first thing India teaches you is patience. Americans are very impatient people. We want to walk into a store, pay the price on the thing that we're buying, retail, and leave. India teaches you everything's a negotiation. Everything may not work on the time schedule that you want, but it forces you to know yourself. Everything's negotiated in the marketplace in India, right? There's no set price.
Culture,
It's 100%. And Americans don't get this, because we think it's unfair somehow. Like, are we being ripped off? Indians think the opposite. If you pay retail, you're definitely getting ripped off. So you better negotiate down if you are worth your salt as a human being. And that can be at the diplomatic level too, where we're in a hurry to get things done. And I understand why. We're America. The world looks to us for leadership, to resolve issues, problems, to get investments. But vice versa, there's something about the iterative process of negotiation that helps you better understand what you really want. Why are you here? What are your values? And in the end, what are your interests? So India's taught me that patience. Second, it's taught me too to not just see things in binary ways. People, when they describe India, often describe it good and bad in a very binary way. It's the most marvelous place in the world. It's dirty. It's a place that is great because strategically it can help, and we see the world in the same way when it comes to great power competition. Or no, it's a place that's struggling with human rights and this and that and the other. Look, democracies and diverse populations are messy by definition. America is. I mean, look at ourselves. But would you rather have a boring monochromatic culture, a non-democracy? Of course not. I would say India's democracy is like democracy times 10. We vote in the United States, for instance. You pick a team, 85% of us, whether we register as independents or Democrats or Republicans, we vote D, we vote R, with very little difference. The Indian voter is a true small d Democrat. You might vote for one party at the state level, but then you go to that party and say, what are you going to do in the next election for me? I'm switching over and voting that way. It's much more, again, transactional in a good way, where they're like, if I'm a voter, you got to earn my vote every single election. You don't take me for granted. So I think it's taught me that patience. It's taught me about power rests in each one of us. And it's also taught me that multiple truths can coexist. It's not always black and white.
Let's take a step back for
Yeah.
a moment. The story of India, the US-India strategic partnership, it's not like it happened overnight, right? This has been in the making for decades.
Yep.
And now it just seems like, India's really, this is India's moment. So talk to us about the trajectory over the last 3 decades.
Yeah. I think people often start there in the late 60s, early 70s, when a pivot to China moved us away from India at the government to government level. And they assume kind of, oh, India and the US didn't get along for a long time. And then when President Clinton came towards the end of his administration, there was really strong diplomatic work that then George W. Bush carried on, that President Obama, President Trump in the first incarnation, now President Biden have done, that has really surged us to a place of closeness. I rewind the clock a little further. I mean, you can go back as far as 1792, when the second consulate that a brand new nation opened wasn't in Europe. It was in Calcutta, which it was so important. We actually weren't recognized because the British Governor General was so upset with the former colonies that became America that they didn't recognize the Consul General, Benjamin Joy, who left there. But then remember, during World War II, we supported India's independence movement. We wanted to make sure that there was, an independent India at a time that Britain didn't. We, earlier than that, helped build some of the first dams in the country, had companies like General Electric provide electricity. We helped the largest aid assistance program from one country to another was the agricultural assistance that India then paid us for. We returned that money to help found Indian Institutes of Technology and start higher education. So the US-India relationship is actually one of deep friendship with a little hiccup in between, and now one in which I think we really see the sky as the limit. It's a place where on technology, our critical emerging technologies from AI, quantum, semiconductors, telecommunications, space, biotech, climate and energy tech, we are sharing some of our deepest technologies in research and development. People to people, we have more Indian students in the US than from any other country in our institutions of higher education, second most visas in the world. It's our second largest diplomatic mission after our neighbor Mexico in the world. So as you look at these things, I think today is a place where Americans really love Indians, Indians really love Americans, and our leaders reflect that.
And there's familiarity now, right? And how much of that has to do with India's soft power?
Well, it's first of all, I think comes from, you're an example of this, the diaspora, your parents, other people's families who have come. What was the old joke? You couldn't become a CEO in America if you're Indian American. Now you can't become a CEO if you're not Indian American. I mean, we have so many successes in politics, culture, government, research, universities, business, finance. So I think Indian Americans have been this incredible bridge. But secondly, more and more non-Indian Americans who are American are learning about India, taking the time, being patient about traveling and getting to know and build those relationships. So, to me, I think Americans have clearly said India is part of our future, a deep, close part of our future. And India is crystal clear about that too. We're not going to just do what the other one wants, but we are going to walk together. Our hearts feel alike, our heads think alike. I think the real challenge is, can our feet move quickly enough together to meet the challenges from climate change to great power competition to ending wars and empowering women? Can we move those places quickly enough together to meet the moment?
So that's an interesting point that you bring up. So the U.S.-India strategic relationship over the last 10, 15 years, people, some would say, has really taken off, right? And there's a lot of progress that's been made in the last 10 years. And so as we think about global realignment that's happening in a multipolar world, India has long-standing relationships, with Russia, for example, and Israel. How do you think the U.S.-India strategic partnership will help in this new context?
Yeah, I think it's a huge force for good in the world when we work together, not just to have a bilateral relationship, but our impact together in the multilateral and global commons. Good example, this during G20, we were able to bring together a unanimous resolution in a moment of war, two wars. I think there was only one at the time. It hadn't broken out yet in Gaza and Israel. But you saw India speak to countries that we didn't have good relations with. America speak to countries that India didn't have as deep a relationship with, and together say, let's get something done. You see this in the Indian Ocean with Indian patrols going after hijackers and pirates that are coming off of the coast of Somalia, working alongside where our ships are doing that. You see that in the climate space. You see this where we're training health workers from Fiji and the Philippines together in New Delhi with American money and Indian expertise. We're going to Africa together to help with solar power in Tanzania, electric buses in Kenya. So this force where we act together, not just for India's interest and America's interest, is very, very powerful. Second point I'd say is that our strategic alliance is it's not a formal alliance, and India doesn't like to have formal military alliances, and we respect that. And they have historical friendships that we have to also understand, even if we stand against things like the unprovoked war that Russia has waged in Ukraine. The test of a marriage, if we want to use that as a metaphor or a relationship that you're in, isn't whether you love each other, because clearly we do. It's what happens when you have your first fight. So when we have moments where maybe we aren't exactly aligned, are we able to be resilient enough to move forward? And so far, I think the evidence is clear. Even when we have to say some tough things to each other or find out that this is happening or this conversation, this relationship, I think we're able to still advance our relationship. And that's the depth of this friendship now, not evidence of a lack of friendship. And that's the misinterpretation. People often think, oh, if you're fighting or you don't agree on 100%, you're not close. What relationship do people agree on everything? It's really the language of dealing with conflict, navigating that, moving forward, and still doing the important things that you care about. Technology transfers, number one military partner for India now and exercises in the US, bringing things like the jet engine technologies that we haven't even shared with some of our closest allies. That evidence is crystal clear that the future of India strategically is with the US and vice versa.
India is positioning itself as a strong alternative to China in global supply chains. Which industries are poised to benefit the most, and what infrastructure or policy improvements are necessary to accelerate this transition?
Well, look, the world's China plus one strategy, which isn't anti-China as much as it is no one country should be able to throttle global supply chains, whether it's for critical drugs and medical technology, or whether it's manufacturing, critical minerals, the future of green power. I think India is marvelously positioned, but still is in the process of figuring out what are the best rules, how can they reduce the barriers to investment to make sure that we have people that are running to India to diversify their supply chains. That's something I've worked very closely on. For instance, India can now produce solar power as cheaply as in China, but doesn't have the equipment to do so yet. So we're using elements like the Development Finance Corporation of the US. Number one country in the world we invest in is in India, 10% of our global portfolio. We brought a great American company for solar to have a manufacturing plant in Tamil Nadu in southern India that's manufacturing solar panels for India and for the US at an inexpensive price and creating jobs and doing great things. So for me, that is great evidence of how we can use this as a force for the global good that also serves India and the United States. You know, one thing I've learned about diplomacy is it's a mix of shared values and friendships and interests and issues. And if you just say, well, we're close friends, why aren't we agreeing on everything? You will be heartbroken. And if you just say this is only about interests, you will be way too cold to really advance things. So you have to be able to sometimes recognize interests aren't always exactly aligned and that have to be negotiated, and that real friendships can be developed that help those moments get through the challenges and the differences of opinion in order for win-win solutions to come forward. We don't know what will come in the next few months, whether tariffs will come or not. You know, we all want fairer trade. We want domestic jobs to be protected. Globalization hasn't helped everybody equally, but we also know that more friction between countries can lead to less trade, even greater suffering economically, and even the worst case scenario, things like wars. So I'm very proud as ambassador, for instance, we took the trade disputes between US and India and resolved them so that Washington apples, California almonds, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars of exports from the United States came to India in the last year and a half. And similarly, India is investing in the US, taking old steel mills and reviving them, going into mines that were shuttered and getting them, as well as cutting edge technologies for electrolyzers or IT services, hiring Americans in America. And I think most people think, oh, India is a place that takes jobs, when in the reality is India investments are actually creating jobs just as we do in India. So getting past looking at win-lose situations and trying to figure out a way to get to win-win, I think will be critical. Bringing up unfairness isn't bad as long as it leads to deals and doesn't just lead to chest thumping.
What does FDI look like in the United States?
Right.
What is it going to look like 10 years from now? Ratan Tata had passed away recently. People would say that Ratan Tata had exported Indian values, right? As he went global with Tata. What are Indian companies going to do here in the US? Are they going to export, you know, are they going to impart their shared values in the communities that they're serving and operating in?
Well, you know, one of the things I've been very impressed, and it's partially by law in India, but that's a reflection of values, is that Indian companies have to give a percentage of their profits to charity, a law we don't have in the United States of America. And so you've seen companies like Tata that have been deeply involved in women's empowerment, human rights, education, looking at the environment, building communities, alleviating poverty. It's a great example, I think, for the United States, and I expect that same corporate culture will come to those Indian investments in the US. And I'm glad you pointed out that Indians were the #1 delegation to Select USA when we invite the entire world to come to the US to invest. But it wasn't just the most bodies, it was the most dollars invested of any country. I think that blows a lot of Americans' minds. India is the top investor coming out of Select USA into America. So it really is a two-way street of understanding, you know, we think that only America invests in the world. People come to America, whether it's European companies, whether it's Japanese, Korean companies, and now increasingly Indian companies. We are tied in a global economy where many Americans now work for incredible companies in India. And that's a real opportunity for us to kind of humble ourselves a little bit, that it's not just America going out there and saving the world. We are interdependent on each other. And I believe when countries become more interdependent, we become more peaceful. When we become more interdependent, we become there's a deeper understanding of each other, and that it can be really a force for good. So I would encourage more Americans to visit, to look at potential investments from India in the US. And for students in particular, we already have, you know, the most students, as I mentioned, in higher education in America coming from India of any country. But more Americans should go and study in India, where it's easier to do. And we've tripled the number of Americans studying in India just in the last couple of years, because that knowledge will make you a better businesswoman or man. It'll make you a better investor. It'll make you a better politician, better government person, a better NGO director, a better doctor, whatever it is. India has so much to teach us. And again, I think if we come as students, not just as teachers, then we can equalize this relationship in a respectful way and advance it further. So overall, FDI is still stronger coming from Canadian, European, Japanese companies in pure dollar terms. But the growth is coming more and more from India. And out of the conference, the most dollars that we announced came from India. For instance, $100+ million investment from a steel company, JSW, that's investing in making parts for wind turbines, the towers, in Texas now, instead of us exporting those from other countries. So it's something that actually helps us have more Americans steel manufacturing. There's another company that's in Minnesota reopening an iron ore plant and also a mine to be able to do that. In Ohio, a shuttered steel plant. In North Carolina, an electrolyzer plant. In New Jersey, IT companies. In the California, agricultural investments being made in all sorts of nuts and drinks and health food. You know, you can really look at this in a very diversified way. And increasingly, we're seeing FDI come in. While it's not yet the top 2 or 3, it's my expectation in the next decade that India will be in those top 5 countries in both absolute dollar amounts, but also number of employees, because that really is good news for the US and showing how globalization, when done right, works for everybody.
You recently had invited pension fund managers to India and did a roadshow.
Yes.
And so how did it go?
It went great. You know, we had a wide net. We had pension funds that came out of big states, California, New York, New Jersey, Florida, Texas, you know, representing hundreds of billions of dollars, if not over $1 trillion of funds under management. And I think a lot of them wanted to better understand India. We weren't saying you have to go to India or these are the companies you should invest in. We wanted to just create a platform. We worked with Milken, who invited people, and had a chance for them to meet with Indian government officials who are doing infrastructure funds, the National Investment and Infrastructure Fund in India, but also looking at the patience you need to have in investing in India, where don't just come overnight, look to put your dollars down, get them out a couple of years. It takes, you know, 3 to 5 years to really get to know the country, see where you want to invest, put some people on the ground. But it is the most incredible stock market right now. It's the largest rate of growth of any major economy in the world at 7%, and potentially keeping that going for a decade or 2 at least to come. 5th largest economy, soon to be the 3rd largest, and probably in the century, the largest economy in the world. So our message, we've started a capital, we call it BFF, Building Financial Futures. So it's a great thing to be a part of if you're out there and you're a capital placer or a pension fund. I think there was a lot of stories that American pension funds got burned in the past. And so now we're coming. But if you look at Canada and others who have come for a long time, it has been well worth the investments, which is bringing back good return for, in that case, Canadians, but one day also for Americans who depend on those pensions and can be a force for progress in India.
So what sort of industries and sectors are we looking at here?
So I think, you know, infrastructure, physical infrastructure, digital infrastructure, energy and climate. When you look at some of the key critical emerging technologies like semiconductors, telecommunications, AI and quantum, space and defense is an amazing place where things are taking off. And I would say also biotech, which is, you know, not just the kind of generic drugs and other things that come out of India, but the innovation, medical equipment, new cures for disease. Those are all very vibrant places. And we're putting a real emphasis on women-led entrepreneurs as well. India has an incredible, you know, women-led cohort that is increasingly starting companies, running companies, and we think that's a key to India's future success as well. So those are great industries, great leaders. And I would also say India is so vast. Don't just go to the obvious cities. Meet with, you know, the state leaders in the 28 states and the 8 union territories of India who may have a connection to the next big thing, because we're seeing them come up from the less obvious places, schools and villages even, where there's incredible entrepreneurship and innovation. So I'm an ambassador, I'm a diplomat, not an investment advisor. So all of you out there, please take this not as investment advice, but just the observation of, you know, America's ambassador in India to see, you know, it's a very stable investing environment in terms of the stock market, very high rate of returns, though those can go up and down, as we know. I think patience is the main thing. It's not a place to make a quick buck, though plenty of people probably do. It's a place that inevitably is driven by the demographics of India. India's largest state, Uttar Pradesh, which is just to the east of Delhi, it is about 1/3 the size of Texas and it has 230 million people in it. India's going to add another 200 million people. There are Indians who are 15 years and younger are the equivalent of the American population. So demographics will drive, I think, a lot of consumer products, retail, technology. But also the second thing I would say is that just indexing yourself to India's growth alone is probably smart for money in the future. But what I get excited about is the way that Indian innovation is changing the way people live. You know, through phones now, data is 17 cents per byte, I think, use for the average Indian. It's about $7 for us in the United States. So it's very low barrier to entry. It's a place where India is further advanced than the US and other countries in certain areas. It's further behind in other ones. But when you look at that ability for especially a digital backbone, to me, the things you can layer on top of that now that every, 800 million people have a phone, a device, a cheap data connection, that means there's a huge marketplace for anybody, whether it's an Indian company or an American investor.
So AI jobs, more than 40% are gonna be in India. So there's a level of reskilling that's going to be involved here, right? Globally.
Yep.
And I know you're in the current administration right now, but are you able to talk to us about, this FDI, that's investment that's happening by Indian companies and the reskilling that's required?
There's no question that skilling piece, as we call it job training, but in India, it's called skilling. Job training and education is going through a huge transformation in India just to meet the demand, but also the global demand. You're seeing in places like the Emirates,
Right.
Saudi Arabia, Qatar, here, Europe, and of course in the US, that Indian tech workers, and these are not blue collar jobs, these are white collar jobs that sometimes go on to being the C-suite, is something that people around the world are reaching to. And we won't have not only at that C-suite, but people with AI who will monitor data centers, look at the hallucinations of the AI systems and make sure that they humanize them. India, I think, is well positioned. We've had so many back offices here in India, but increasingly it's really the front office too, where there's people who are doing the design, the engineering, the innovation. And I think India, given all the languages that it has, is a great test place for how AI can work across languages. It's also a great place where the data, everybody has a digital ID, healthcare records. And so a lot of the innovation that relies on that data of 1.4 billion human beings, I think will be very advantageous. And lastly, if the energy on green energy can be kept up, it's a place that can have low carbon output or zero carbon output for the servers that will need to drive the AI revolution that's happening.
So there's also, the reality check, right? That there are risks and challenges in the India market. And I'd like for you to just talk to us now about those risks and challenges and the policy and regulatory environment.
I would say, look, all these things are still worth looking at India and navigating this. But the snapshot we often say from the embassy today is that there are these, I call them the T's, the barriers, whether it's tariffs that are generally higher, especially on manufacturing for components brought in. I always point out when I was mayor of Los Angeles, the ships that came in from Asia to our port helped support manufacturing in the US because we can't make 100% of anything. So if 20 or 40 or even 60% of a widget came in from that boat, it allowed us to do the finished product and competitively sell it without putting a tariff on those components. India still has more of a wall around their economy. So that's tariffs. Taxes are sometimes higher, although I think there's been good moves to move that down. Of course, the trade rules, it's still a competitive sport with India, between the US and India. There's much larger restrictions on a lot of that trade. Talent, as we talked about, making sure the training is there and you can get the workforce. I think companies are generally satisfied they can train people quickly. They're very smart, folks graduating, but they might not have the exact skills coming out of college. And then, trademarks. I think the intellectual property protections are going to be absolutely critical. And what I say, the last T, transportation and infrastructure, which is being built out at a mad pace, nevertheless is still challenging. It takes 87 hours to get goods out of a port on average, whereas in India, it can be a half hour in Hong Kong, an hour or two in the United States. So those are going to be challenges, I think, to navigate. And the last piece is every state's different, just like the US. So it's a federal system where the rules, regulations on labor, on taxes, on other things might be incentives, might be strong in one state, they might be less strong in another state, and each has to be negotiated separately. So again, know India, navigate India, look for local partners, and be aware of some of those challenges.
India in a globalized world, what does it look like? So we're sitting here in Abu Dhabi. It's a very different story, in the Middle East. Talk to us about the IMEC.
India is really coming into its own on the global stage, and the US is working with India. We're looking at how do we build non-coercive trade corridors that really benefit the global commons. How do we protect the seas and trade from whether it's a missile being shot by the Houthis or whether it's people who ignore how far out their territory is supposed to be, people who deplete fisheries versus conserve them. India has been a wonderful partner. India is also very engaged with this region, which is not new. Think about it. They call it West Asia because geographically it's west of India. What we call the Middle East has been historically tied to India since the old spice route came through here to Europe. So IMEC, the India Middle East corridor, which is to link Europe all the way to India, is an idea that came out of G20 last year. And I'm confident in our lifetimes we will see it get built out for telecommunications, for trade, for investment. I think the supply chains too will increasingly, the China plus one strategies will come to India. It's just a matter of how quickly they will. And I hope India makes, even more aggressive decisions to make that more frictionless, to make more American companies come, not just for the Indian market, but into India to manufacture so that we can have telecommunications equipment that doesn't just come out of a non-democracy, so that we can have semiconductors that are competitive, have drugs that we're able to buy, pharmaceuticals that are important to come out of multiple countries. I think that is really those trusted corridors of trade, the trusted manufacturing, supply chains, and then third, the strategic corridors to make sure that stays free and open. So it's the India, US, Australia, and Japan. The US and Japan, US and Australia have very strong bilateral relations. So this is, in some ways, India is to determine where does the Quad go together. But we just had the summit in Delaware with the heads of our governments together, which there was commitments made on everything from humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, to the freedom of the seas, to a cancer moonshot to end cancer in our lifetime, and so much more. We know these countries each bring something different to the table, but when countries act together, instead of solitary countries saying it's our way or the highway, we're going to dictate the rule of the road, we're going to indebt countries based on our envisioned trade corridors that benefit us but not them. I think it is showing that the system, while it may not be a system of alliances or the United Nations that on its own can run the world, that these multilateral, mini-laterals as they're kind of called, are a way of what I call geometric diplomacy, triangles, quadrilaterals coming together to being larger than the sum of their parts. As I mentioned in the panel today, US not plus India, but US times India. And imagine US times India, times Japan, times Australia, how much we can do.
And Ambassador, you had talked about in one of the times I heard you speak about multinationals, that there's still opportunity for so many American multinationals to go to India.
No question.
And why haven't they?
I think a lot of them have and have for centuries. John Deere, Coca-Cola, from consumer products to industrial products to electricity infrastructure, and increasingly investment funds that are coming in as well. But I think India scares some people because it is so big, so complex. But I would say that's exactly why you need to be there. It's so big you can't ignore it. It's where the growth in the world is happening. I'd go back to those 3 C's. Yes, it's challenging, but hopefully over time less and less challenging. But it's also compelling. And it absolutely is consequential. If you want your company or your life to be about something, consequence, come to India. If you want it to be about something that's interesting and compelling, come to India. And you can navigate that. Lastly, the challenges, I think, increasingly more and more. And we're seeing people who are those interpreters, those navigators, those translators, who are saying it is well worth the time, the investment, and the knowledge. And I personally am very grateful for how India has enriched my life, just on a personal level in my family's life. And I think that's something you don't always get just investing in a country. Whereas going to India, you'll get something personally out of your time there as well.
And last question now. So as you reflect on your time as ambassador to India, what have your overall observations been, and what's your outlook, for next year, for 2030, for 2050?
So, I don't know what the world will bring. As Secretary of State said, we have the most challenges simultaneously globally in our lifetimes. Multiple wars, retreat from globalization. It's unclear who's going to run the world and what systems are going to. On the flip side, I think people are becoming less lazy about diplomacy, about trade, about that rules and institutions by themselves will guide us. And I think it requires us all to be more thoughtful and to create new relationships, to go to the places we've never been, to form the friendships we've never had, to push ourselves into new technologies and to humanize them. And I, in the end of the day, trust human beings a lot. We're a very stubborn race of animals that want to survive, that love to innovate, and at the end don't want conflict, even as we see it out there. So I think that US and India will be a force for good. I'll make that prediction, for the next, 10 years. I think this next year will be a year you have to think quickly, you have to respond, and don't always take opening salvos as the final destination. And we're gonna have to learn to negotiate. One of the things I love as ambassador is I've told my team, you have to learn to negotiate like an Indian. Everything isn't retail, it's relational, and it is iterative. It's not instant. And if we can figure out a way to hear each other, to come to listen and learn and not teach and preach, I think I'm very optimistic about the future, even as we face some of the greatest challenges of our life. Last thing is, I believe that if we don't confront the climate crisis, the pollution that exists, today in India was yesterday and still in China, it's existed in the United States as well. What are we leaving behind for our children? What are we leaving for ourselves now? It's estimated that living in New Delhi, 8 to 10 years, if you have to work outside of your life, is reduced simply just by the air pollution. So I'm committed to the same lessons we learned in a city like Los Angeles, where I grew up, of how we can clean up the air, how we can reduce the impact of our behavior on the weather, on our globe. I think that'll be the most important thing, together with the empowerment of women, to define the success, not just of US and India, but of our world.
What's next for you?
I don't know. India's taught me to stay open to the world. I have loved being an elected official and serving my local community. I've loved being together with mayors around the world, and now as a diplomat to impact global issues. Money has never been the thing that motivates me so much as making a difference in the world. I got to survive, but I think I will take some time after being ambassador to kind of just breathe for the first time in 2.5 decades nearly, of working 7 days a week, spend some time with my daughter and my wife, and really see what comes next. I think so often we live either in the past or the future. Everybody asks me, what are you going to do next? And I said, the question that occupies my mind is not what I'm going to do next, but who I want to be next. And I can't wait to answer that question. Well, thank you everybody for joining Heard in the Corridor podcast. You won't see me next time because it's a new exciting guest each time, but you'll see Angela next time. Thank you for joining us here in Abu Dhabi, that's bridge between the United States and India. Have a great week, and we'll see you soon.